It was just a bench at the courthouse plaza, nothing special. But to her, with her aching legs and trembling hands, it meant relief. Yet when she lowered herself gently toward it, a group of teenagers slid over, blocking her path. "Find your own spot," one sneered. Laughter followed. She didn't argue. She just stood there, cane shaking under her weight. 10 long minutes passed in silence. Then, from across the square, boots echoed on the pavement. Not one pair, dozens. And when they reached her, the teenagers finally realized that woman wasn't standing alone. Her name was Margaret Maggie Holloway, 76 years old, a widow, and a grandmother of 3. To most who passed her on the street, she was just another elderly woman with thinning silver hair, leaning heavily on a cane. But there was more to her than met the eye. Maggie was a veteran, a nurse who had served 2 tours during the Vietnam War. She had been the steady hands in field hospitals where chaos reigned, the quiet voice that told young soldiers, "You'll be okay," even when she wasn't sure they would be. Life had not been easy since. Her knees were ruined from years of service, her back never fully healed from lifting stretchers night after night. She lived alone in a small apartment near the courthouse, surviving mostly on her pension. Still, she carried herself with dignity. Every morning, she polished the small Marine Corps pin her late husband had given her, fastening it carefully to her jacket before stepping outside. That morning had been colder than usual. Maggie had come to the courthouse plaza for a simple reason: a community event honoring local veterans. She didn't expect recognition. She never did. She only wanted to sit quietly on the bench beneath the old oak tree, to listen as school children sang the anthem and the mayor gave his speech. But when she tried to sit, she was pushed aside by laughter and indifference. The pain in her legs screamed with every passing second, but she didn't speak. Years of service had taught her patience, discipline, and silence. Yet as she stood trembling, the very ground beneath her seemed to shift, as if the world was about to notice her in a way it never had before. Maggie's goal that morning was painfully modest. She only wanted a seat, a chance to rest her body, to preserve her strength long enough to make it through the ceremony. She had been looking forward to this event for weeks, not because she craved attention, but because it was one of the rare days when her service, and the service of those like her, was acknowledged. Veterans Day in her small town was more than a holiday. It was a moment of belonging. The plaza buzzed with life. Families gathered with folding chairs, children waved small flags, and vendors sold coffee and hot chocolate from nearby carts. The sound of chatter filled the air, blending with the distant toll of the courthouse bell. Everyone seemed to have a place, except Maggie. She scanned the crowd, clutching her cane tightly. If she could just make it to the bench, she could last the next hour without collapsing. But when she approached, the teenagers sprawled across it barely noticed her presence. Their music played, low from a phone speaker, the sharp smell of candy wrappers mixing with their laughter. "Excuse me," Maggie said softly. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of years. One boy glanced up, then quickly looked away. Another slid further across the bench, blocking more space. Her goal had been simple, a seat. But in that small moment, it became something larger. It became a battle for dignity. She didn't want to beg. She didn't want to make a scene. She only wanted the courtesy that every soldier had once offered each other without question. Space to breathe, space to endure, space to rest. But courtesy was not what she found. Instead, she was met with mockery. "Find your own spot," one boy muttered without even looking at her. The others laughed, as though denying an old woman a seat was a kind of sport. The sound bit into her like shrapnel. Not because it was cruel. She had faced cruelty before, but because of the indifference behind it. She tried again, her knuckles white around her cane. "Please, I just need—" "Lady," another interrupted, smirking, "we got here first." He stretched his legs wider, taking up even more of the bench. The laughter grew louder. A girl nearby giggled, pulling out her phone as if ready to film. Around them, other adults pretended not to notice. Parents kept their eyes on their children, couples sipped their coffee, and the mayor's aides busied themselves near the podium. Not a single person intervened. Her body screamed for rest. The ache in her knees had become unbearable. The cane trembled under her grip, not only from weakness, but from the sting of humiliation. Yet Maggie didn't lash out. She had once held the hand of a 19-year-old boy as he took his last breath. She knew what true suffering looked like. This was different. This was invisible pain, the kind that came from being overlooked. She stood silently, back straight, staring at the oak tree behind the bench. Her obstacle wasn't just the cruel laughter of teenagers. It was the silence of everyone else. The world seemed to tell her she didn't matter anymore, that her years of service, her sacrifices, were forgotten. But in her heart, Maggie knew something none of them did. She had never once stood alone. The minutes dragged like hours. Maggie could feel her strength draining. Her vision blurred slightly as she shifted her weight from one leg to the other. She feared she might collapse, right there in front of the courthouse, humiliated not by cruelty alone, but by the quiet acceptance of it. The teenagers' laughter softened into idle chatter, but the damage was already done. They had claimed the bench, and with it, her dignity. Every second she remained standing seemed to confirm their victory. Somewhere nearby, a little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why is she standing?" The mother hushed her quickly, glancing nervously toward the teenagers before turning away. Maggie's lips curved into the faintest smile. At least one child had noticed. The ceremony was minutes away from starting. The mayor's voice crackled through the speakers, welcoming the crowd. The anthem would follow, then speeches, then a moment of silence for the fallen. Maggie wanted desperately to last through it, to stand for the anthem not out of necessity, but out of choice. But the tension in her chest grew heavier. Each breath came shorter, her grip on the cane slick with sweat. She felt herself wobble slightly. Pride was the only thing keeping her upright. And then it happened. From across the plaza came a sound distinct from the chatter, distinct from the bells and speeches. It was the sound of boots. Heavy, deliberate, echoing against the stone path. Not one pair. Dozens. Heads began to turn. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders for a better view. The laughter at the bench quieted. The air shifted, thickened. Maggie's heart skipped. She knew that sound. She would never mistake it. The sound of soldiers marching. At first, no one understood what was happening. The mayor paused mid-sentence, blinking toward the far side of the plaza. Shoppers froze with coffee cups in hand. Slowly, the crowd parted as the first row of uniformed figures appeared. It wasn't part of the ceremony. No one had expected this. A full unit of soldiers, boots polished, uniforms pressed, marched steadily toward the courthouse steps. Their movements were crisp, perfectly in sync, the kind of precision that turned heads and silenced crowds. Maggie's eyes widened. She recognized the insignia on their sleeves, an infantry battalion stationed nearby. She had treated men from their unit decades earlier, when they were nothing but frightened recruits in a foreign land. Now here they were, moving as one. The teenagers shifted uncomfortably. The music from their phone cut off. One of them muttered, "What's this about?" But his voice carried none of the earlier bravado. The soldiers didn't break stride. They marched straight past the mayor, past the podium, past crowd. And when they reached the bench, they halted in unison. The plaza fell into absolute silence. The only sound was the echo of boots against stone. Then, without a word, the first soldier, a captain, stepped forward. His eyes met Maggie's. Recognition flickered. And in that instant, the unexpected twist became clear. This ceremony wasn't about the mayor or the speeches or even the anthem. It was about her. The captain turned sharply to his men. "Unit, on my command." The order rang out, firm and unmistakable. Every soldier moved as one. In a single fluid motion, they pushed back their chairs, the chairs reserved for them near the front rows of the plaza. The sound of metal scraping stone was like a thunderclap in the silence. Then, as if rehearsed 1,000 times, every man and woman stood tall, back straight, eyes forward. They did not salute the mayor. They did not salute the flag. They turned their bodies toward Maggie. The crowd gasped. The teenagers shrank against the bench, suddenly small, their laughter replaced by nervous silence. The girl who had been ready to film with her phone now lowered it slowly, her cheeks red. Maggie's cane trembled in her hand. Tears welled in her eyes. For a moment, she felt the years fall away. She wasn't just an old woman struggling to stand. She was part of something greater, a chain of sacrifice and service that had not been forgotten. The captain stepped closer, his voice steady but full of weight. "Ma'am," he said, "you stood long enough. This seat belongs to you." The soldiers nearest the bench stepped aside, forming a path. No one in the plaza moved, no one breathed too loud. Slowly, Maggie lowered herself onto the bench. Her legs shook, her cane rattled against the stone, but she sat with her back straight, eyes shining. The soldiers around her remained standing, every last one of them. And at that moment, the world knew she would never stand alone again. For a moment, Maggie thought she could finally rest, but the silence did not last. From the edge of the crowd, a voice rang out, sharp, dismissive, meant to shatter what had just been built. "She doesn't deserve all that," a man sneered. He was in his 30s, arms crossed, bitterness carved into his face. "She's just an old woman. Probably never saw combat. Why waste the time?" The words cut deeper than any teenage laughter. They carried the cruelty of someone old enough to know better, someone who should have understood respect but chose contempt. Maggie's breath caught in her chest. Doubt whispered in her ear. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was nothing more than a forgotten nurse, someone who patched wounds while others bled. She had spent decades invisible. After all, she had been overlooked at grocery stores, ignored at hospitals, dismissed in conversations. Was this moment just another illusion, one that could be shattered with a single voice? The crowd shifted nervously. Some lowered their heads. The teenagers on the bench looked relieved, as if someone else had spoken what they didn't dare say aloud. Maggie's shoulders sagged slightly. The weight of years pressed harder. She thought of the young men she had held as they cried for their mothers. She thought of her husband, who never made it home. And she thought of the countless times she had walked past the very people she had once served, unseen, unacknowledged. Her eyes lowered to her lap. For the first time that morning, she felt small again. Alone again. The laughter and sneers seemed louder than boots, louder than silence, louder than anything. And in that fragile instant, it seemed the dignity she had briefly regained might slip away forever. But the captain did not let the silence linger. He turned sharply toward the heckler, eyes hard as steel. His voice cut through the plaza like a blade. "Enough!" The man shifted, startled by the command. But the captain wasn't speaking only to him. His voice carried to everyone. The teenagers, the mayor, the parents, the silent crowd. "This woman is Margaret Holloway," he said, each syllable clear and deliberate. She served 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat nurse. She pulled men out of burning trucks. She held boys in her arms while they took their last breath. When this country called, she answered. And when her body broke, she carried on anyway. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Parents lifted their children higher to listen. Even the teenagers who had laughed now looked pale. The captain stepped closer to Maggie, lowering his voice slightly, but keeping it firm. "You may see an old woman with a cane, but I see a soldier who never stopped serving." And then, in one perfect, unified motion, the entire unit around him raised their hands in salute. Dozens of hands, dozens of soldiers standing straight, their eyes fixed on Maggie. The crowd followed. A veteran in a Korean War cap rose and saluted. A father lifted his child's hand to mimic the gesture. Slowly, like a wave, the plaza filled with raised hands, heads bowed, and silence so profound it felt holy. The heckler lowered his gaze, his defiance dissolving under the weight of so many eyes. He sank back in the crowd, forgotten. And Maggie, trembling, tear-streaked, overwhelmed, finally lifted her own hand, returning the salute she had not given in decades. This time, the silence was not cruel. It was reverence. The air was electric with unspoken gratitude. Maggie sat straighter than she had in years, her cane resting across her lap, her hand trembling as it held the salute. For a heartbeat, She wasn't 76. She wasn't frail or forgotten. She was back in uniform, surrounded by her brothers and sisters, strong enough to carry the weight of the world again. When she lowered her hand, the captain knelt in front of her. His eyes glistened, though his voice remained steady. "Ma'am," he said softly, "on behalf of every soldier who ever made it home because of women like you, thank you." Maggie tried to speak, but her throat caught. Only a whisper escaped. "I was just doing my duty." The crowd stirred. A woman approached, pressing a folded handkerchief into Maggie's hand. A young man followed, removing his baseball cap with trembling fingers. Then a little girl stepped forward, clutching a tiny paper flag. She held it out with both hands. "For you," she said shyly. Maggie's tears spilled freely. She took the flag and pressed it gently against her chest. Around her, the soldiers remained standing, not moving, not wavering. They weren't just protecting her body. They were shielding her dignity. And then the unexpected happened. The mayor himself approached the bench. His prepared speech lay forgotten in his hand. He cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "today's ceremony was meant to honor all veterans. But I think we all know who deserves our honor most." Applause erupted. Not the polite kind, not the brief kind, but the long, rolling thunder of a town finally remembering one of its own. For Maggie, it wasn't about revenge on teenagers or silencing a heckler. It was about something far greater, being seen again. The ceremony transformed. No longer about speeches or schedules, it became a living tribute to one woman who embodied quiet sacrifice. The soldiers flanked the bench, forming a protective line. The crowd, once distracted and indifferent, leaned forward, eager to hear Maggie's story. For the first time in decades, her voice carried across a public square. She spoke quietly, haltingly at first. She told them about the nights in Vietnam when helicopters roared overhead, about the boys who called her mom as she stitched wounds under candlelight, about the letters she carried in her pocket for soldiers who never made it home. "I wasn't a hero," she said. "I was just someone who stayed." The crowd listened in pin-drop silence. Even the teenagers sat frozen, shame etched on their faces. Some of them wiped their eyes when Maggie described the hardest part, writing to mothers and fathers who would never see their children again. When she finished, there was no applause. Not immediately. There was only silence, deep, aching silence. And then, slowly, the crowd rose to their feet. Every seat in the plaza emptied. Every person stood, shoulders back, hands folded, eyes locked on her. Not one remained sitting. The soldiers didn't command it. Maggie didn't ask for it. But the entire town rose, as if pulled by an invisible thread of honor and respect. Maggie looked around, her heart swelling. She had come for a seat. Now, an entire community was standing for her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost walking among the living. She felt like herself again. Margaret Holloway, nurse, veteran, survivor, soldier. And most of all, she felt seen. Weeks later, the courthouse plaza was different. Where once teenagers sprawled across a bench, a bronze plaque now rested against the stone. It read, "In honor of Margaret Holloway, who stood when others would not, and reminded us all to rise." Visitors paused their daily. Children traced the letters with small fingers. Veterans left flowers, patches, and medals beside the plaque. Even strangers stopped to sit quietly, as if the bench itself had become hallowed ground. Maggie visited often. She would sit with her cane resting at her side, watching the world move around her. People no longer looked through her. They greeted her, offered coffee, stopped to listen. Some asked about her service. Others simply said, "Thank you." One afternoon, she noticed a familiar face, the teenage boy who had once mocked her. He approached hesitantly, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. In his hand was a folded note. "I'm sorry," he murmured, offering it to her. "I didn't know who you were." Maggie took the paper gently, smiling faintly. "It's not about who I am," she said. "It's about respecting what others have carried." The boy nodded, tears threatening his eyes. He sat quietly beside her, no longer taking space but sharing it. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the plaza. Maggie heard it again, not in reality, but in memory. The echo of boots striking stone. The sound of unity, of dignity restored. That day at the courthouse, the town had risen. Not just for her, but for every veteran who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten. Some uniforms fade, some medals tarnish, but respect, once remembered, has a way of echoing forever.